You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
You're listening to the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. Join me as we uncover the rich histories of North America's Great Plains, exploring the latest archaeological discoveries and past cultures that shape this storied region. Welcome to the podcast. Welcome to episode 15 of the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. I am your host, Carlton Gover, and I'm thrilled to have you join me on this exciting journey through the rich and fascinating histories of North America's Great Plains. I'm not feeling great, everybody, so sorry about that. Coming off a little bit of a cold over the weekend, needed to get an episode, but really excited to talk with everybody here about the Woodland Period. And so we've kind of gone off the rails a little bit these past couple episodes, right? Like we had the tribute to Lance, bored you all to death with taxonomy, and then the last episode we talked about Civilization 7, not necessarily quite archaeology. So we're kind of jumping back into talking about broad strokes, major cultural periods within Great Plains archaeology. So the last time we did this, we talked about the Archaic period. We were talking about Nebo Hill being part of what seems like one of these very early pottery cultures across the Southeast and Midwest. And so that's like in the late Archaic. And so now we're starting to transition into the Woodland period, which very broadly, if you read Doug's book, Doug has a whole talk about like when does woodland start or end, and roughly like 500 BC, give or take, year of Sundays or something like that. But it goes as early as like 700 BC. But what's most important to know that many of these changes, as discussed in previous episodes, like the lifeways that change on the Great Plains are by and large happening on the eastern periphery, the closer you get to the Missouri River, right? Diving back to those first couple episodes where we discussed the environment of the Great Plains, like the eastern part of the Great Plains, has an area that is more dense in vegetation. It's not as cold. Summers last longer, winters are shorter. And so that's where you have a lot of vegetation growth, right? That's also the tall grass prairie. And, people in the western part of the plains, the high plains up until the Rocky Mountains, like they're doing the same stuff they've always been doing since the Paleogene period. That's where you go to hunt bison, hunt game. That's not to say that those are separate people in the eastern parts and the western parts. No, just largely the behaviors that people are doing between these two zones. You hunt in the west, you grow crops in the east. And so the Plains Woodland period is occurring between, let's just say like 500 BC and roughly like 1200 AD. Some people will cut it off at 1,000, but there's still some of these, especially in the Central Plains woodland lifeways that are still persisting into the 1200s. And why is it called woodland? There's not really woods on the plains. And we touched upon this in the taxonomy episode, right? Great Plains archaeologists noticed that many of the settlement systems and material culture from this time period was already established in the Southeast and Midwest, right? So we adopted that term woodland, and that doesn't always mean they're contiguous, right? Like the Midwest has a woodland period, then a Mississippian period. In the Great Plains, we have a woodland period that goes into Plains Village. We don't have a Mississippian period out here. So they're not interchangeable, and they do need to, probably the names need to be changed. What categorizes Plains Woodland as being different than the Archaic period, however, is in the Woodland period, we see an increased use of cultigens. We're seeing more domesticated crops appearing. So maize isn't the big crop yet, but we're seeing squash, beans, goosefoot, a little bit of maize, but we are starting to see the appearance of these cultigens and early changes away from purely hunting and gathering. We're starting to see horticulture or gardening. So we're not full-blown agriculture yet. We're doing small-scale gardens. in a settlement pattern where we're talking about like a couple houses in a community. They might also not be contemporaneous, but people are still very heavily reliant on hunting and gathering, though. But we're seeing an increased sedativism. And 3 episodes ago, when we talked about Nebo Hill and it being outside the Kansas City area, well, we have some major changes going on across the Midwest and Southeast, where we see the origins of the Hopewell culture. Now, Hopewell is really known in Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana, and rightly so. That's where like the major centers are. And the Hopewell culture itself, and we'll explain how it comes back into the Great Plains. But the Hopewell culture begins around 100 BC, give or take. And these were mound builders. Now, they're not the typical mound building societies that we associate with the Mississippians by any stretch of the imagination. However, some of these sites and earthen structures that created were like hundreds of acres in size. And we're seeing a heavy increase in trade goods. So we're also talking about, like in Ohio, we're seeing obsidian coming in from Wyoming and bison goods coming in from Canada. That there's this fantastic map of, I think it was part of like a Hopewell conference or something, that showed at a single mound site the different goods that were found within this Hopewell mound structure. And it's all over. And if we can look at, well, how did that happen? If you look at a map and you look at a river map of the United States, the Ohio River dumps into the Mississippi, which also connects to the Missouri, all roughly around the same area-ish. And so these, as we've talked about before, rivers become a highway of trade and connection between the Great Plains. Now, why does this matter to anybody? How does this matter to the Great Plains? Well, in the 1950s, we like archaeologists, uncovered a Hopewell culture outside of Kansas City, very close to Nebo Hill. And so we're seeing this connection again, this place in western, like northwestern Missouri and eastern Kansas becoming connected to this larger system. And, what defines Kansas City Hopewell? For a long time, it was believed that Kansas City Hopewell represented migrants coming in from Illinois or Ohio. We know that's not true now after Adair and some others redated a bunch of sites. We're seeing that not only was Kansas City Hopewell a continuation of earlier woodland groups, that there are Kansas City Hopewell specific cultural traits. So it's not a migration of folks coming out of Ohio and displacing locals. These are locals, which makes sense, right? If we think about Nebo Hill and already there being a precedent in the late Archaic of connection through the river systems, it's not, that those memories of connection and connectivity or relationships of trade don't just disappear. And so it's not out of realm that some of these populations continued. And so, here in Kansas, though, I will say in the in the Great Plains, Kansas City Hopewell, especially in Kansas and Missouri, has become an all-encompassing term for anything belonging to the Middle Woodland period. Now, Middle Woodland is roughly from like 1 BC to 500 AD. That's just not true. So like one thing that I've talked about with Mary, because Mary still comes to the office here at the University of Kansas, is that anything that has dated to that period just gets labeled Kansas City Hopewell, when no one really has done a systematic study of what Kansas City Hopewell is. But for this Middle Woodland period, this Kansas City Hopewell period, where there used to be mounds outside of Kansas City, they're gone now because of Kansas City, that there needs to be some systematic analysis to really define, hey, we can tell looking at some of the pottery that the pottery is distinct, but what else makes Kansas City Hopewell distinctive from the other Hopewellian groups? Because if you look at a map of Hopewell, right, you can see you have the Ohio Hopewell. Out in Ohio, you have the Crab Orchard. Out in Illinois, South of us in Oklahoma is the Cuestas Cooper. You have a central Missouri. You have Havana up the Mississippi. And then you have Marksville Hopewell, which is the Louisiana, Mississippi Delta. So these cultures are being largely connected. And I believe it's the Arkansas River that connects the Cuesta Cooper to the rest of the Mississippian system. These are all connected through the riverine systems. And there's a number of sites here in Kansas, and it's just the pottery is very similar. We're seeing the mound structures, and this is happening in this middle period. And to really get this point across, right, as previously stated, Kansas City Hopewell, originally believed to represent migrants, is now, understood to be local woodland groups who are doing something new, very similar to their neighbors down the road, and could, arguably be, that next step, not necessarily next step, but it's not unsurprising considering we have the Nebo Hill stuff, which was, earliest pottery around the same era, very, really close, right? Within 20 miles of the Nebo Hill site to Kansas City Hopewell, they're still incredibly close, separated in time, yes, but kind of hitting on those connections. And the pottery is, if you Google the pottery from Kansas City Hopewell, especially some of this Markwell types from Louisiana, it's intricate. This is intricate pottery. There's no doubt that there's some sort of connectivity going on. It has a mix of different tempers, temper being the additives to clay for firing so that it doesn't break. That we have some really incredible examples of continental trade and interaction that are occurring right at the turn of the millennium, right? So we're seeing these spheres of influence being built east of the Rockies. And that might be an episode later about, cultural othering and related groups, and we'll get to that. But we'll be right back after this break. We'll be right back with episode 15, looking at the Woodland Period here in the Great Plains. And we're back. So in a later episode, we'll talk probably more dedicated, a whole episode or two on Kansas City Hopewell specific sites. But, the Hopewell culture, there are some of the mounds were burial mounds. There have been some ridiculous theories as to, what ended the Hopewell culture. Some folks believe it was a friggin' comet, and that's been widely debunked. I believe that paper was retracted from the paper that was the journal it was published in. And we're just right around 500 CE. The woodland culture, this Hopewell culture across the Midwest and, the eastern periphery of the Great Plains and the lower Missouri River Valley region just stops. And so mound building stops, and we're not entirely sure what happened. People could have just got tired of it. But then we go into, in the Great Plains, we go into this late woodland period, and mound building ceases. Later, if you look at, especially Cahokia, right, which starts picking up again around, I think its height's 1100 or 1200, starts picking up around 950, that many of these same regions in the east, down the stream from the Missouri River, do mound cultures again. We get the Mississippians, and maybe a good analogy for what we're seeing is if we look at ancient Greek city-states, we see Crete being this epicenter early on of a chiefdom culture complexity, and then later Greece proper comes to prominence. And we can maybe make some of those same analogies where Hopewell is the equivalent of that ancient Crete being that forerunner to later cultures that appears. We see vestiges of relationships through, Nebo Hill, and maybe some of those early ceramic cultures in the late Archaic begin to appear. But in the Great Plains, we don't get mound building, but there's a fun paper that I made my students read by Brad Logan back in 2022, not that long ago. But in the late woodland period, around where Kansas City Hopewell used to be dominant, we still see evidence of interactions, and these are more localized. So there's this really fun paper that he had that was on feasting and social networks in the lower Missouri River region. And at these Quixote sites outside of, northeast Kansas, northwest Missouri, through lipid analysis or looking at the fat residue of ceramics and other tools, evidence of feasting events. And that caught my eye thinking about it, because no one's really looked at feasting features here in this part of the country. Feasting is such a integral part to many complex civs, right? Bringing people together. And there's many different reasons, right? Like we can think about it today. When you bring all your friends to dinner for like a social event, celebration, holidays are big feasting events. People used to have done that through time from all the same different, for many different reasons. And so kind of hitting a point that I've talked about before, where there's just not that many archaeologists interested at the academic level of Great Plains Archaeology. Everyone wants to work in the Southwest. Everyone wants to work on Mississippian, or more importantly, people that do work on the Great Plains are mostly doing Paleo-Indian stuff. They're not working on more of the complex civ that's more indicative of Plains Village or Kansas City Hopewell. Like if you go through the literature on these places, especially in Kansas, right, which has been has had such a strong focus on local Kansas archaeology. Like it's Mary and Bob Horde, Mary Adair, Bob Horde, Lauren Ritterbrush, and Brad Logan, basically University of Kansas, Kansas State, and the Kansas State archaeologist working on these sites. And so getting back on topic, I don't know too super much about Kansas City Hopewell, just broad strokes. But the fact that in the same area after Kansas City Hopewell has, ceased to exist, the people didn't disappear. People stopped practicing culture like Kansas City Hopewell, if that makes sense. Like they stopped building the mounds, and probably people voted with their feet, meaning they just walked away. But in the same area to see feasting events, which are much more common in the archaeological record being associated with socially complex or socially stratified communities, maybe even though the mounds stopped being built, the pottery in that way stopped being made, that some of these cultural practices of feasting and community building still persisted, 500, 200, 300, 400, 500 years later, right? Because feasting isn't just like, all right, especially back in these days, it wasn't like you could just order a bunch of subs from Jimmy John's. Like there was preparation involved. You couldn't just text anybody. You had to send a runner out to go let people know where the feast is. Like there's a lot of planning that goes on to coordinating an event such as feasting. And I wanted to bring it up because potentially we could see echoes of this Hopewell culture in this area through this feasting event. And I'll put a link down below to this paper that you guys can read to look at the evidence that they present, the lipid analysis, but also some of the roasting pit features that they found. But, one thing to ask is how do we know this was for feasting? And these roasting pits aren't necessarily for what we see up, or aren't similar to what we see up in Head Smashed In, right? Which I think we talked about Head Smashed In, right, on this podcast? Possibly not. But, Head Smashed In, there's plenty of roasting features where they're processing inordinate amounts of bison to get bison grease for pemmican. So maybe these, it could be also said hey, Brad, possibly. But Brad's a really smart guy. And also in his paper, they do talk about Head Smashed In this idea. Anywho, so that's just kind of wanted to brought up about what's going on with Woodland and some after Kansas City Hopewell, right? Because the mound structures were beautiful. The pottery is beautiful. For everyone to just kind of stop doing that, what could have happened? Warfare could have been hypothesized, but even afterwards, maybe some of those cultural behaviors, they didn't just cease with Kansas City Hopewell declining, right? Traditions still persist. But Woodland is also, I want to round out this today's talk, we're just kind of talking about, maize. It's around this point we're seeing corn come into the Great Plains, right? Which today, the Nebraska, Kansas, Illinois, these areas are so synonymous with corn. But remember, corn comes from maize comes from teosinte. Maize and teosinte are both from Mexico. They are desert crops, desert grasses. And Mary Adair here at KU, who I talk about a bunch, it's because one, Mary studies pollen and microbotanical remains, and so she's able to identify some of these remains at sites and be able to understand like the phytoliths, Maize starches that are present, and to identify the presence of these sites. And it's within the woodland period that we begin to see maize. And like I said, next episode, where I believe we're going to be talking more about the Plains Village period, which is something I know much more about, where maize becomes dominant. Here we see the presence of maize, but it hasn't really taken off quite yet. And so yeah, I think Mary said that beer might have been maize beer, could have been present at some point. Anywho, this is cold brain taking over. I got like really excited to talk about Kansas City Hopewell and talk about some of these feasting events, but let me summarize kind of what's happening over on the Plains Woodland. So in earlier episodes, looking at the Archaic and Paleo-Indian, we're talking about a time span of like 1,000 years, over thousands of years. This woodland period in the plains, we're talking about like a 1,700 year time span. It's like much shorter than what we've talked about before, and a lot of things were happening fast. We glossed over early woodland because nothing too special is happening, but like Kansas City Hopewell mound building, people purposely creating monumental structures, that's big. People, we're seeing evidence of feasting, that's big. The introduction of maize, that's big. All on the tops of Nebo Hill, which is nothing like too crazy, but as the oldest pottery in the Great Plains right next to Kansas City, we know it's connected. We're seeing these connections in the Great Plains being reinforced elsewhere in the United States, in particular the Southeast and Midwest. It's also during this time we start to see, hypothesize, when the bow and arrow becomes an adoptive technology, right? People didn't come here from elsewhere outside of North America with bows and arrows. That came here with atlatls and spears. It's around this middle woodland period, or the woodland period in general, we believe the bow and arrow was introduced to the Great Plains. Now we're also seeing in this time period like corn and maize is being introduced. Hasn't taken off yet, but what we're doing is setting the stage, right? Because Hopewell was pervasive across the broader Mississippi River drainage system. Ends around 500. We're going to see Cahokia start taking off, like really 10,000, 11,000 AD. What's up the Missouri River from Cahokia, and that's the Great Plains, where we have established through Kansas City Hopewell, where we've established through Nebo Hill, these connections, right? So like, this is what I always try to stress to my students, like keep note of what we read about in earlier segments, because these things are connected. And so in the next episode of the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast, we're going to look into the Plains Village period more succinctly. We're going to start talking about the early Plains Village period, Central Plains tradition, Oneota, talk about some really cool things that are happening, some big changes that we're starting to see, as well as more types of archaeological evidence that we can see through more settled systems that we can infer more human behaviors from, right? Like, it's really hard to talk about human behavior and culture and really do like the anthropology in archaeology and hunting and gathering systems. We're starting to get to a point now where like we can really look at anthropological archaeology and some really cool things that are happening in the Great Plains. With that, I will see you guys all next time. This has been Dr. Carlton Shield Chief Gover. I don't know how to end this. See you all in 2 weeks. Take it easy. Peace. Thank you for listening to the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. You can follow me on Instagram at Pawnee_archaeologist, and you can also email me at greatplainsarchpodcast@gmail.com. And remember, anybody can love the mountains, but it takes a soul to love the prairie. American author Willa Cather.
The Archaeology Podcast Network is 10 years old this year. Our executive producer is Ashley Airy, our social media coordinator is Matilda Siebrecht, and our chief editor is Rachel Roden. The Archaeology Podcast Network was co-founded by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle in 2014 and is part of Cultural Media and DigTech LLC.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.